Welcome back to Trade Links, brought to you by NatWest. My name is Tim Phillips. And welcome back to our regular panel. That means Aastha Gupta, European economist, economics and market strategy at NatWest Markets. Hello again, Aastha.
Hi, Tim.
And also Scott Livingstone, international advisor for NatWest Group. Hello again, Scott.
Tim, good afternoon.
We've mentioned it before on Trade Links. There are a few routes in the world that are a nexus for commodity trade. It's hard for us to comprehend the volume of goods that flow through these points, or indeed the damage to the world economy if that flow was choked off. Well, numbers, geopolitics, and potential disaster. This sounds like a job for Aastha and Scott. So our topic today is commodity trade routes. Aastha, the big question, first of all, what are these routes? What are the main routes we're discussing here?
Well, if you're picturing the arteries of global trade, I think it's the big three: the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and the Strait of Malacca. Because these are the routes where the majority of global shipping traffic flows through. And disruption here, even for a few days, throws off supply chain, delivery schedules, and even price stability around the world. So take the Suez, for example. It handles about 12 to 15% of global trade. The Strait of Malacca is even busier. It's the lifeline between China, Japan, and the Indian Ocean. And then there's the Panama Canal, which links the Atlantic and the Pacific, and it's key for goods moving between the Americas and Asia. If one of them gets blocked, it's really like shutting down a major airport, wherein everything gets delayed and costs pile up fast.
Now, I did say it's hard for us to comprehend the scale of trade going through this. It's hard for me, is what I really mean. So please help me out, Aastha. How much trade is flowing through these routes?
So when it's business as usual, we have no droughts, no attacks, or no delays. These routes carry trillions of dollars in goods every year. Through the Suez Canal, you've got energy, electronics, machinery, chemicals, and more than $1 trillion in goods pass through it every year. The Panama Canal is essentially important for grains, fuel, and containerized goods between Americas and Asia. If we zoom in a bit, about 30% of global container traffic flows through the Suez. Roughly 6% of global maritime trade moves through the Panama, and it handles 40% of US container traffic alone. And if you look at the Strait of Malacca, it handles around 25% of the traded goods, including massive volumes of oil, liquefied natural gas, and manufactured goods. And on some estimates, over 15 million barrels of oil per day passes through it. So these aren't just busy shipping lanes, they're the conveyor belts of the global economy.
Well, the Straits of Malacca, 25% of all traded goods. Scott, are there less known routes, though, that are also strategically important?
Well, Tim, I'll come on to a less well-known route, but I think if Aastha has listed the top three, I've got to add the fourth because it's so geopolitically important, and that's the Straits of Hormuz between Oman and the Emirates and Iran. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, and then onwards towards China, India, and Japan. And it really is the exit point, the sea exit point for most of the Gulf countries. And pretty much all of Qatar's natural gas passes through it. 20% or so of global oil pass through the Straits of Hormuz. But the reason I'm raising it is because geopolitically, it is our current live point of tension, given the geopolitical issues around Iran and Iran's nuclear program. And some observers, which I agree with, suggest it is Iran's last point of geopolitical leverage after the recent action where their other geopolitical levers have all been destroyed or significantly weakened. So if we do see a rise in geopolitical tension with Iran, then all of the focus on the scenarios, the consequences, will center around the Straits of Hormuz and the interruption to those oil and gas supplies. But you asked for something which is less well known, but also important. Here I'm going to introduce land routes. So far we've been speaking about sea routes and sea transport, but obviously the implication is they bring choke points and they bring vulnerabilities, and therefore there is an effort to generate land routes. And the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative for some time now has been developing routes across Eurasia. And there's a variation of this, the Belt and Road routes, which is called the Middle Corridor. And again, it links China through the Central Asian republics and in towards Europe. But importantly, it doesn't go through Russia. And so I think we pay attention to this new route. It is under construction at the moment. There are areas that are still to be finalized, but that is something to look out for the future, and it will bring strategic benefit to linking Asia with Europe. And then finally, there's an interesting variation on this route, Tim, which is the Zangezur corridor, and it links Azerbaijan and Turkey. And I think that's a shortcut on this route, which runs through a recent area of geopolitical conflict. Now, there is a peace process, but this corridor is seen as one of the positive outcomes of that conflict in Azerbaijan.
You mentioned this to me before, and I'm ashamed to admit to you, I had no idea where it was, so I had to go and look it up. Don't tell anyone about it, but when you see where it is, you can really understand how important it is. Aastha did qualify what I asked her when I was talking about the volumes of goods that go through these corridors. She said, when it's business as usual. Scott, for all of these routes, is it business as usual?
I mean, Aastha's quite right to bring all of these routes have, and particularly since President Trump has come to power, President Trump seems to have brought a laser focus on the viability of trade, conducting geopolitics very much through the lens of trade, and then very much through the lens of critical trade, vital goods that must be supplied for the American national interest. And that's where we end up with tensions around the Panama Canal. That's where we end up with the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea, which point towards the Straits of Malacca. And as I just mentioned, the Straits of Hormuz with the tensions with Iran. We've also seen President Trump declare a peacemaking role in the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict. It's one of his 7 conflicts that he claimed at the United Nations recently that he has solved. And an interesting little side bit to that one, he was very quick to move onto the trade route after declaring his role in that peace process. And in fact, that corridor, that Zangezur corridor, has been renamed the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. So he really is putting his stamp on this potential new trade route and the benefits that come from the construction, that come from the licensing, and of course come from the trade itself. So these are all geopolitically important. They're all geopolitically live to a greater or lesser degree. And as we see conflicts, as we see tensions and competition rise, you can expect to see pressure put on all of these trade routes.
The Trump route for international peace and prosperity. I am hoping that there will be a giant sign at each end of it. Aastha, always, you have the data at your fingertips. In the Red Sea, when we've had these recent conflicts, it is not business as usual. What has that done to the flow of goods?
It's been a major shock to global shipping. Since the Houthi attack started picking up in late 2023, traffic through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal has dropped dramatically. At the worst point, container ship activity fell by over 70%, and by mid of this year, it was still down by around 40 to 50% compared to normal. And what we've seen is that a lot of big shipping companies chose to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, which added anywhere between 10 to 14 days to the journey and can cost up to $1 million more per trip in fuel and insurance alone. And for Europe, all of this matters because a huge portion of goods from Asia, including electronics, clothing, machinery, usually comes through that route. So when traffic slows down, you start to see longer lead times, higher shipping costs, and possibly even upward pressure on inflation in some markets. And it's basically a textbook example of how geopolitics bleeds into economics.
Also, I learnt the Panama Canal has had problems, but those problems have not been conflict on either side of it. This has been drought. What has been happening there, Aastha? How big a problem is this?
I think this is one of the climate-related stories that doesn't get enough attention. The Panama Canal relies on rainwater-fed lakes to operate its lock system. It's not just really a waterway, it's a freshwater elevator for ships. But what we saw that with the drought in 2023 and early 2024, rainwater hit really record lows. That meant that the water levels dropped so much that the canal authority had to limit the number of ships and the weight of the vessels that were allowed through. So at one point, they cut the daily transits from 36 to just 22 ships per day, which is a big deal when you're handling over 5 to 6% of global trade. And some ships had to offload containers to make it through. Others got stuck in week-long queues, and many just rerouted. Trade through the Panama Canal dropped by about 30% year on year early last year. And that ripple effect spread. We saw that the grain prices ticked up, fuel routes got reshuffled, and insurance premiums also went up for certain voyages. And it's a reminder that climate shocks can also act like economic shocks.
I live by a canal. There is a lock about 50 meters from where I'm sitting now, and you forget that that is multiplied many, many times over the Panama Canal and how important that is. That is remarkable. And as you say, very underreported. I have a hot take here. Climate change, not all bad. I understand that there are Arctic routes potentially opening up. Aastha, where are these Arctic routes? Why are they important?
I think this is the part of the conversation that feels like science fiction is slowly turning into reality. So Arctic routes, especially the Northern Sea route, which is the Northeast Passage, along Russia's northern coast, they're becoming viable as sea ice melts. So in theory, this route could shave off about 10 to 15 days off the trip between Europe and Asia compared to going through the Suez Canal. So in 2024, we saw a record number of transit voyages through this route. 97 ships made the full Arctic passage, moving about 3 million tons of cargo. Of course, that's still very small compared to Suez or Panama, but it's still growing. Russia is investing heavily in new ports and icebreaker fleets to support these routes. But it's obviously not without complications, as yes, there is huge potential if done carefully. But the complications are such like the season could be still short, ice conditions can be unpredictable, and geopolitical risks still persist. So if current routes stay unstable and the climate change keeps shifting, the Arctic routes could just become more than just a backup.
Not without complications. Scott, is the ownership of the Arctic clear? Who owns these routes?
No, that's the nub, and so not without complications, a wonderful understatement. Then Aastha's point about geopolitical tensions are in place. I think they're just beginning, to be honest with you. I think this will be a theme that we will add to our list of geopolitical tensions in the coming years. The Europeans and Americans have woken up, frankly, to the potential of this Northern Sea route, not just in trade terms, but in military terms as well. And I think they've also woken up to the fact that Russia does have this built-in, the moment advantage in terms of ports. And as Aastha says, in terms of nuclear-powered icebreakers, for example, they vastly outnumber the fleet from the West. So there is a response happening now. NATO countries are building new vessels or planning to build new vessels, and metaphorical flags are being stuck into bits of land saying that this is Norwegian or Canadian or whatever. And we're seeing comments from President Trump again. If you recall his comments on Greenland, part of that was the geographical position of Greenland regarding this northern routes. So I think we're at the beginning of the beginning in terms of geopolitical tensions over the Northern Sea routes. I think they will continue. And I think at the core of it is the question you ask is whether these waters, particularly around Russia, are Russian waters or whether they're international. And at the moment, there is no agreement on answering that question.
I look forward to the announcement of the Trump very cold route through the Arctic. Thank you very much for that discussion about the routes. I think we ought to discuss a little bit more about the commodities that go through those routes in a moment. Okay, so let's talk about some of these commodities because they are strategically important. And so I'd like to know how governments are responding to the uncertainty and the disruption around it. I'm going to ask you, it's a quiz show moment, I'm going to ask you to pick two each and talk about them. Aastha, you go first.
So coming straight off what we talked about earlier in the first section about the disruption in the Red Sea and the Panama Canal, one of the biggest responses came from the US with its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, where it released a huge amount of oil reserves to balance out the disruption that we saw. And what's significant here is the shift that we saw, wherein the reserve isn't just for military emergencies anymore. It's being used as a shock absorber for global supply chain stress, especially when energy markets go haywire.
Yeah, that has huge economic implications, doesn't it? Scott, what would you pick as your first one?
Without doubt for me, the geopolitical commodity of the day, of the year, of the rest of this decade will be a set of critical minerals, and include what we now commonly call rare earths, 17 rare earth elements, but a broader set of critical minerals that once they're refined, they play absolutely crucial roles in the future strategic technologies, both civilian and military. And this summary of the situation we have at the moment and the pivot of the geopolitical tension is that there is a monopoly of the extraction and very much the refinement of these minerals held by China. So we've got Chinese over the last few decades have gathered together quite a number of concessions of the extraction of these minerals. But more importantly, they have absolutely cornered the market in the manufacturing of the refined minerals, which is an environmentally dirty process in many cases. So I think we're now in this position, again, it's another example of geopolitics in the West catching up with their true dependencies. And we're seeing a flurry of activity from countries in the West, in the US, pretty much everywhere, to generate new sovereign or reliable supplies of these minerals. But it will take time. And until that happens, then China has a very, very effective geopolitical lever to pull. And we are seeing it in action, Tim, in the current talks going on between the US and China. So this is a highly effective geopolitical tool. And for the time being, for a number of years until the West figures out alternative supplies, this will shape Western relationships with China.
We spent such a long time thinking about how do we get more trade flowing and how do we balance out supplies. For example, what Aastha was telling us about the US reserves. And this is a reminder as well that actually what we need to think about is what happens when some country, some region corners the market in something. Aastha, what's your second example?
My second example is very much in line with what Scott said.
Aha.
I think it's around critical minerals. Because what we've seen is that governments are redrawing the commodity map to become more self-reliant and strategically secure. I mean, because they're reacting to longer-term vulnerabilities in supply chains. So take Indonesia, for example. They used to export raw nickel ore, but after global shortages and the rising demand for electric vehicle batteries, they've banned the exports. And now they require local mining and refining. And it worked. They're now a key global supplier of battery-grade nickel. Even Chile, which is doing something similar with lithium. And these moves are important because they show how governments are not just reacting to short-term disruptions, but trying to get everything closer back to home.
This is the sort of industrial policy that we didn't see for years and has now really come back and has become strategically important. Scott, what are you going to pick as your number 2 choice?
Number 2 one is, for me, is interesting, and it's something which I'm looking into. We got a flavour of it during the COVID pandemic when there was a sudden surge for pharmaceuticals and PPE, etc. And I'm rather shocked to discover that the supply chain of the commodities that form the basis of our pharmaceuticals, so active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs as they're called, the building blocks of these medicines, again, there are concentrations of supply, and those concentrations at the moment, the bulk of them are in China and India. Now, the EU is in third place, and the US does have a manufacturing capability, but it's some way down the chain. So really, China and India have their hands on this lever should they wish to pull it. And I think if you were to ask any government about their critical supply chains, it wouldn't take too long before they said, well, the supply of medicines to the population. So I think this is a lever to look out for. It doesn't often feature, but it's there, and it's there in the backs of minds when people are in negotiations.
One more example of things that are not manufactured in the United States that we assumed were. Scott, bonus round. I think you've got one more thing you wanted to talk about.
I would just remind everyone that there is another commodity, not often traded, certainly not yet, but nevertheless will become geopolitically important, and this is water. And I think it ties in many of the points we've said before, and it brings in the climate crisis, because I think this will be a sharpening geopolitical issue in the future. If you want an example, then I would draw your attention to India and Pakistan. After the tension, the crisis in May, and the Indian government declared that they were withdrawing or pausing on their participation in an agreement around the Indus water basin that feeds both countries. And furthermore, they were threatening they may take measures to restrict water supply heading into Pakistan. The Pakistan government, this is existential. This is already a water-stressed country. And so their response was to say, well, if that were to happen, we would treat that as an act of war. So here we have a direct correlation between the management of a commodity and then geopolitical relations and tensions.
Today, we are all over the map, but I mean that in a good way. As I often say, I've got a feeling that we'll be following some of those up in future. Okay, so now we reach the point where you tell us what is on your agenda, Scott and Aastha. What is something that you are thinking about that maybe we have not been thinking about yet? Aastha.
One story which has been very recent that might have slipped under the radar is the US scrapping its $800 de minimis threshold for imports. And this rule essentially allowed small exporters to ship low-value goods into the US without customs red tape, especially which was useful for e-commerce. For now, even a $50 product faces full custom checks, added costs, and delays. So for small firms, that's a big shift, and many are scrambling to adapt. And basically, this is just a reminder that how even small regulatory changes can trigger supply chain rewiring, especially when margins are tight. So for me, I think I'll be watching out if companies on the ground do tie-ups within US to go around this exemption.
Scott, what's on your agenda?
Tim, in amongst all of the rather busy geopolitical scene, I'm still paying particular attention to the situation in Syria. And it's a really interesting issue, in my opinion, for a country that I think really matters. At the moment, what we're seeing are attempts by the new Syrian government, led by Ahmed al-Sharaf, a former jihadi terrorist, a designated terrorist, and the external powers from America, Europe, and the Gulf, trying to encourage and enable the emergence of a new state, an inclusive, unified, and peaceful Syria after the horrors of the Bashar al-Assad regime that fell last year. So this week, we've seen al-Sharaa address the United Nations General Assembly, which was remarkable. We mustn't think that that indicates the job is done. He's facing incredible problems to keep this evolution happening. There's factionalism, there are severe economic hardships, and obviously destroyed infrastructure after years of civil war. So this is a very, very fragile situation. But I think it matters because the neighborhood, frankly, could do with some good news. And if it fails, and if we see a Syria consumed by civil war, then it not only a dreadful situation for Syrians, but it will bring in external powers who will then pursue their own motives in and around Syria. So Turkey regarding the Kurds, Russia still has some bases in Syria, and Iran still has the remnants of some proxy organizations in Syria. And of course, the West, the Europeans, and the Americans would be worried about jihadi terrorism on the rise in that part of the world. So there are big stakes at play here. It's a very fragile situation, and the downside risk would be consequential. But the upside risk also would set a terrific example, I think, that countries in that part of the world can move to a better future, can focus on stability and the economy and the well-being of the population rather than factional fighting.
It's really worth bringing a pencil with you if you're going to listen to Trade Links, because you'll want to make notes. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you very much, Tim.
And Aastha as well.
Thank you so much, Tim.
And thank you to all of you for listening. Please do get in touch and tell us if there is anything you want us to talk about. We do read everything that you send in to us. Remember to follow us. Leave us a review as well, especially if it's a good one. We will see you soon on Trade Links.